Good evening. I am Father William Leahy, President of Boston College, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's symposium. Boston College is an institution that very much prizes its intellectual and religious heritage. And part of that heritage requires that we be a place that encourages dialogue about issues of the day. And in our time, one of those very key aspects is to be a place where dialogue about faith and culture can occur. Tonight we have a chance to hear panelists talk about a very, very important aspect of our contemporary world. How is it that artists respond to evil? A question that has been made much, much more apparent, and a question that's on the minds of so many of us in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11th. So I'm glad that you are here tonight, and I welcome you to this symposium, which will engage a question about artists, evil, and our world. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Father Leahy. My name is Colin Murphy. I'm the managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly. We're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with Boston College. It's the second of these annual dialogues. There's one change that you should know about. Cynthia Ozick could not be here because of a medical procedure. She's fine, but traveling was not advised. It is our good fortune that Nathan Englander, acclaimed for his first collection of short stories, was intrigued by the topic at hand, and also that he's working these days in New York and not in Jerusalem, where he has been making his home. So Nathan Englander will be with us this evening. A brief word about what lies ahead. Christopher Lydon, well known to most radio listeners in Boston, will preside as moderator. During the next 45 minutes or so, our three guests will each give a short presentation. Chris will then promote a conversation among the panelists, and after a time, we'll open the discussion to questions from the floor. When the time comes, if you have a question, wait by one of the microphones, and when you're acknowledged, please give your name, and no long speeches. We're delighted to have Chris Lydon on the program and delighted to have his voice back in public. Chris Lydon.
Good evening, and thank you, Cullen. Good evening. We can't be sure what went on at the pep rallies for the hijackers who took the World Trade Center down, but I'd like us to imagine a speech like this, mouthed fiercely by an experienced terrorist. He says, "I have always dreamed of a band of men absolute in their resolve to discard all scruples in the choice of means, strong enough to give themselves frankly the name of destroyers, and free from the taint of that resigned pessimism which rots the world, no pity for anything on earth, including themselves, and death enlisted for good and all in the service of humanity. That's what I would like to see." The speech is not from the Osama bin Laden archives. It's from an old anarchist called Carl Jung in Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent, published in 1907, when the great minds, as well as the crowned heads of Europe, were very much preoccupied by proletarian stirrings and the terrorist threat. The plot afoot in the novel was to blow up the Greenwich Observatory near London. The purpose was counter-revolutionary. That is, the bombing was designed to scandalize the English middle class, to bring on a repressive crackdown by scaring the imbecile bourgeoisie out of its absurd and sentimental regard for individual liberty. Wherefore, the target of the bomb had to be carefully chosen, as the master plotter from an Eastern embassy, Mr. Vladimir, said, "It wouldn't do to blow up a church or the monarchy or the National Gallery of Art for mere sensation. What had to be done was to identify the sacrosanct fetish of their time, the source of material prosperity, which was science, popularly represented by the Greenwich Observatory. The bombing outrage, said Mr. Vladimir, must be purely destructive. It must make the most alarming display of ferocious imbecility. Reading Conrad again during the fall, I suppose that the attackers of 9/11 very likely brought the same studiousness to their selection of the World Trade Center and the so-called global economy as their target. But the really marvelous thing in reading it was that once again, a novelist got there first, as novelists so often do. It's because the novelists get there first that we're here tonight, and all of us so eager to hear from our prophetic guests. I was alerted by a New York Times piece just after 9/11 about 3 great novels that anticipated so much of our stewing this fall, not just The Secret Agent, but Dostoevsky's novel Demons, about revolutionary politics gone bad, sometimes titled The Possessed in English, from 1872, and also Henry James's stab at a Dickensian and political novel, The Princess Casamassima, from 1886. As a dutiful child of the New York Times, I went and read the books so that I could recommend them all heartily tonight. Each of the master novelists anticipated not only the fiendish and murderous plotting behind 9/11, but they also anticipated the moral inquiry that we're renewing tonight, the question of evil against a background of belief and non-belief. Dostoevsky's moral in Demons was provocatively Orthodox Christian. The demons that torture his delusional cell of nihilistic revolutionaries were bad ideas from Europe, to wit, rationalism, empiricism, materialism, positivism, socialism, and of course, atheism. Dostoevsky's model of Russia out of the Bible is the madman that Jesus cured, the man who called himself Legion in the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 8, the man whose demons Jesus drove into a herd of pigs who then plunged into the sea. And toward the end of the novel, the repentant old teacher says this. He says, it's exactly like our Russia. These demons who come out of a sick man and enter into swine. It's all the sores, all the miasmas, all the uncleanness, all the big and little demons accumulated in our great and dear sick man in our Russia for centuries. And he takes the demons rather personally, himself among them as a teacher. He says, we will rush insane and raging from the cliff down into the sea and all be drowned, and good riddance to us because that's the most we're fit for. But the sick man, Russia, will be healed and will sit at the feet of Jesus, and everyone will look in amazement. Henry James in The Princess Casamassima imagined a comparable network of incendiary plotters in London in the 1880s, a network in which his hero grows up, but from which he tries too late to withdraw. In James, it's not orthodoxy so much as aesthetics that takes its stand against reckless radicalism. A revolution, as James's hero decides, will destroy too much art, and in that sense could destroy civilization. It will tear the Veronese paintings on the ceilings of the Doge's palace in Venice into strips so that everyone might have a little peace. Henry James's tragic hero admits that he has come to a great horror at that kind of invidious jealousy which is at the bottom of the idea of a redistribution. But he has been tempted beyond the point of no return. The short of it is, it's just a privilege and a thrill to be reminded by the great writers that on the burning issues of culture, poverty, equality, violence, propaganda, terror, war, and evil, that we've been here before. And with 3 significant imaginative writers of our time, it's our privilege tonight to say, here we are again. And then to ask them how they are handling the fearful news of the 21st century. Joyce Carol Oates, Kathleen Norris, and Nathan Englander make a literary jury of extraordinary range and depth. They've all dealt in their writing with these questions of belief, unbelief, and evil. It's a great pleasure to introduce them. And first, Joyce Carol Oates. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very honored and excited to be here this evening. It's certainly a timely subject, and I'm sure it will prove to be quite controversial. This evening, I actually prepared a piece that's rather analytical and philosophical in tone instead of reading some of my fiction or poetry. I thought I would just go immediately to ideas and that we could possibly discuss ideas more readily than we could talk about the aesthetic principles of fiction at such a time. Well, I don't mean my piece to be provocative in any negative way. I've been partly trained as a philosopher, and I deal with ideas. I think ideas are exciting, and they have the whole emotional resonance. The topic that I've chosen to write about basically is just evil, the subject that we have this evening. So that's the title of my piece. To the Spanish, it was the French disease. To the French, it was the Italian disease. To the Germans, it was the Spanish disease. Elsewhere, though not in Great Britain, it was the British disease. More ingeniously, its origins were sometimes believed to be the consequence of extraterrestrial forces, a malevolent conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the night sky. The subject isn't evil, but syphilis. Yet the reasoning is analogous. In the most obvious of ways, we ascribe to others the pathogens in ourselves. We gaze into the face of evil and give it a name not ours, unaware that what we're gazing into is a mirror, and that our instinct is to assign evil to extraterrestrial origins is a unique way of denial of the very human roots of much of human suffering. There is admittedly a lurid glamour to the idea of evil. But to me, evil has never been a theological term. It has no reference to the extraterrestrial or supernatural. Beyond the hemisphere of our planet, evil no more exists than a hothouse atmosphere of our politics, our popular culture, the waxing and waning of our world crises, and the storms that blow ceaselessly over our planet. It has no more currency than such kindred terms as good, beauty, ugliness, justice. These are purely and exclusively human preoccupations, subject to continual change and modification and sometimes reversals. Evil is the mote in the other's eye, a passing wink or twinkle in our own, for which we protest we're blameless and innocent. I make reference in my paper to the work of Elaine Pagels, whom some of you probably know. She's a professor of religion at Princeton and my colleague. Her most famous book, I guess, is the Gnostic Gospels. She's also written The Origins of Satan and Adam and Eve and the Serpent. In Elaine Pagels' The Origins of Satan, published in 1995, an examination of the genesis of Satan in the New Testament and the subsequent demonizing, I put quotation marks around the word, I think Elaine does also, demonizing of putative enemies of Christendom through the centuries. It's noted that this form of Satan never appears in the Hebrew Bible as in mainstream Judaism. Originally in the Hebrew Bible, Satan was not necessarily evil, still less opposed to God. The function of a Satan, this is small letter, Satan, was that of an adversarial role performed by an angel sent by God, quote, for the specific purpose of blocking or obstructing human activity. The Satan's presence in the story helped to account for unexpected obstacles or reversals of fortune. though Elaine Pagels doesn't develop this aspect of the functionary role of the Satan in these ancient religious narratives, it seemed to me when I was reading it quite plausible that the Satan was a device akin to a second or third actor in a play, or the often ingenuous participants of a Socratic dialogue. In other words, the Satan is a narrative device to allow for conflict, debate, resolution, the restoration and reiteration of beliefs and values. In Shakespeare's great tragedies, for instance, Edmund would be a manipulative Satan in King Lear, and Iago, a diabolically inspired Satan in Othello. As the role of the Satan evolved, however, the concept is given a primitive literal presence in religious texts. Not the Satan, but Satan, now with a capital S, starts to emerge as a singular malevolent force in the New Testament. Where the ancient Greeks and Romans seem to have perceived their numerous gods as capricious, rarely wise or moral, they're certainly not moral, projections of human desires, early Christians saw their singular God, the Father, and their singular Savior, Jesus, the Son of the Father, as purely moral, always good and wise, and never capricious. To account, then, for the moral chaos of nature, the allegorical figure of Satan was ever more invested with the power to tempt humankind, as in the crude cautionary tale of the Garden of Eden, a biblical version of such pagan cautionary tales as that of Pandora's box. It's as if a poetic metaphor leapt to life as in comic book magic. Thus Satan becomes an adversary of God, so invested with wiles and powers that he is virtually a shadow god, an almost equal opponent whose domain is pure evil as God's domain is pure good. In The Origin of Satan, as well as in her earlier books, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, and the Gnostic Gospels, Elaine Pagels traces the fascinating ways in which the ever-evolving vision of Christianity Satan serves, quote, to confirm for Christians their own identification with God and to demonize their opponents. First, other Jews, and then pagans, and later dissident Christians were called heretics. In the 21st century, as in earlier centuries of Christianity, baptism requires the convert to solemnly renounce the devil and all his works and to accept the principle of exorcism. Christian baptism would seem to confirm the almost equal status of Satan vis-a-vis God the Father, an astonishing elevation of a minor folktale functionary to a major status. It's as if a maverick congressman from an outlying district in Utah were suddenly granted almost equal status with the United States president, and we would thrill to their televised debates. Whose side are you on is the hyperventilated media question. To examine the historical origins of such cultural archetypes or stereotypes as God, Satan, good, and evil is to demystify these concepts, to dismantle or deconstruct the primitive superstitious scaffoldings that have supported them. This is, of course, a rich, wildly extravagant and imaginative heritage, which we would not wish to banish aesthetically for all the cruel perversity of certain of its impassioned visions. And I have a wonderful quote here from Milton. I could have quotes from Shakespeare or certainly from Dante. But this is a beautiful quote from Paradise Lost. O'er many a frozen, many a fiery Alp, rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens, and shades of death. A universe of death, which God by curse created evil, or evil only good, where all life dies, death lives, and nature breeds, perverse, all monstrous, all prodigious things, abominable, unutterable, and worse than fables yet had feigned or fear conceived, gorgons and hydras and chimeras dire. This is the realm of evil. It doesn't lessen the potency of such visions to suggest that the divine or diabolical dimensions are purely projective fantasies of mankind. In fact, that such fantasies have the power to enthrall some of us to empower us to extraordinary acts of selflessness, I have in parentheses, heroism, fanaticism, martyrdom, depending upon your perspective, suggests the ineffable and enduring nature of such visions. The wish to believe in extraterrestrial forces that condone, confirm, and meticulously guide and govern our human lives is for some a stronger wish than even the desire to persevere in our being. This is a haunting quote from Spinoza. Spinoza saw that beings desire to persevere in their being. We all want to keep on living. We want to survive. And yet these beliefs have the power to make people overcome that desire, hence suicide bombers and so forth. We've seen the power of such wishes tragically dramatized for us in the suicide terrorist acts of September 11th and in similar acts of self-destruction for political and religious causes in recent times. Where we see terrorism and suicide, the performers of such rites see martyrdom. Where we see evil, they see good. As in a nightmare scenario, we who believe ourselves good are perceived apparently by millions of Islamic believers as evil. We who'd imagine that God is on our side is stunned to learn that in our enemies' eyes, we are of the devil. They are of God, and their war with us is no mere politically expedient war like every other war, but a holy war. How like the vengeful mysticism of certain passages of the Hebrew Bible and the book of Revelation of St. John of the Divine are these impassioned but chillingly poetic words. And these are remarks of Osama bin Laden, which many of you heard and have read many times. Praise be to God, and we beseech him for help and forgiveness. We seek refuge with the Lord. He whom God guides is rightly guided, but he whom God leaves to stray, for him will he find no protector to lead him to the right way. I witness that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his slave and prophet. God Almighty hit the United States at its most vulnerable. He destroyed its greatest buildings. Praise be to God. The United States is filled with terror from its north to its south and from its east to its west. Praise be to God. They champion falsehood, support the butcher against the victim, the oppressor against the innocent. May God meet them the punishment they deserve. When we attribute instinctive beliefs to extraterrestrial sources and theological motives to unconscious, biologically driven wishes for self-survival and self-aggrandizement, we are surely susceptible to such stunning, dramatic reversals. Most of us, I'm sure most of us in this gathering tonight, are probably much more comfortable with the concept of evils in the plural than with evil. Evils are multiple and finite. Evil is an alarming singularity, suggesting that all evils spring from a primary evil, as in a theologically defined cosmos. Most of us don't really believe that two polar forces, good and evil, God and the devil, are struggling with each other. We are more likely to believe that there are evils of poverty, illiteracy, illness, political tyranny, and that these evils are remediable. We believe that there are individual, all too human political leaders and self-ordained, quote, holy men, unquote, not so many women, one wonders why, who behave out of self-interest, who appeal to their credulous constituents in the name of good, even as they commit unspeakable evils upon humankind. But we don't believe that these individuals are in a mystic communion with evil or are in themselves evil, any more than we can conceive of ourselves in any scenario whatsoever as evil. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. Lots to think about there and maybe argue about. But first, Kathleen Norris, please.
Thank you. When considering the topic I was invited to address, how a writer copes with the phenomenon of evil, and how I've applied a religious sensibility to the subject, I realized that my turn to prose in the early 1980s, before that I had been exclusively a poet, was in fact occasioned by evil. I began writing my book, Dakota, in response to what I saw happening around me in the western Dakotas when what is termed the farm crisis first hit. In the insular culture that looked remarkably homogeneous, mostly white, native-born, Christian, and working class, bitter divisions emerged. It was no longer enough to blame outsiders for our situation, although, as usual, Jewish bankers were named. But to give you some idea of the level of ignorance involved, the Rockefellers were usually included among them. What impressed me and drew me in as a writer was the way we began making enemies of those close at hand. Town dwellers versus people who lived in the surrounding countryside, bankers versus farmers, and even, sadly, farmers and ranchers who were still struggling to avoid bankruptcy versus farmers who had retired and moved to town and denied that there was a crisis. Sadly, it was young people in their 30s who were the most avid stirrers of strife, who seemed to feel that the answer to our problems was a return to a more prosperous and harmonious time, a past which had never existed. One of the myths that small-town people cling to is that theirs is a magically stable place, a safe harbor in a changing world. And we maintain that illusion in the face of much evidence to the contrary. Change is endemic to the Great Plains. My county's population was over 10,000 in 1910 at the height of the homestead boom. Today it's barely 3,000. When the farm crisis came, in 7 years, 4 churches ran through 8 pastors, and the school went through 6 principals and 4 superintendents. This is serious instability, and our denial of it leads to serious evil. As a priest with parishes in North Dakota said, every year somebody gets crucified. It's usually centered on the school. Someone stirs up controversy and calumny. It's vicious. It's depressing. Now, small-town evil may not seem like much in the context of world events, but for me it is global evil in microcosm. Tribal and or class conflict, the scapegoating of outsiders, usually professionals such as teachers and pastors, a refusal to accept the modern world fueled by the desire to retreat into a more traditional time that exists mostly in the imaginations of a younger generation. While we weren't literally sharpening our machetes, the evil was there. The annihilating instinct was in our hearts. It was evil, and it was homegrown. I felt that I was a witness to something that needed to be described, and my poetry seemed too small a vessel. I turned to prose, and Dakota was the result. One great spiritual solace came into my life during this painful time, and that was getting to know my Benedictine neighbors on the plains, and that occasioned my second book, The Cloister Walk. I found that while monasteries faced all the problems of small-town life, insularity, gossip, pigeonholing, the denial and repression of differences, they were generally dealing with these problems in a healthier way, confronting human evil more creatively. The people of my small town were dealing with evil the way most of us do most of the time, stupidly, inattentively, responding to the threat of change or any perceived threat by becoming defensive, fearful of outsiders, acting out of entrenched and largely unconscious behavior patterns, ordinary human stuff to which none of us is immune. But the Benedictines were a surprise. While they are like a tribe, they even have a myth of origin, as it were, emerging from Benedict's cave, they do not suffer from tribalism, that evil mythology that identifies the tribe as human and others as something less. Even more significantly for our own time, the Benedictines represent a triumph over fundamentalism. Theirs is a living tradition demonstrating that people can honor the fundamentals of a 1,500-year-old way of life without seeking to replicate the world of the 6th century or retreating into an imaginary golden past. The radical hospitality practiced by Benedictines makes them paradoxically open to the world. And you find that monasteries in rural areas, Richardson, North Dakota, for example, or Stearns County, Minnesota, are beacons of cosmopolitanism. Out in the middle of nowhere, you encounter a translator of medieval Dutch mystics, or someone looking at similarities between the Hebrew Psalms and the poems of the Veda. You find a Jewish visitor who feels at home with people who aren't afraid of silence and is delighted to find the monks reading the Book of Ruth at evening prayer. You might find a Tibetan monk or nun in residence It's part of a monastic exchange program that's been quietly promoting interfaith dialogue for nearly 40 years. The more I got to know monastic people, the more I realized that they're not escaping from anything, and certainly not from evil. As one sister put it, Benedict realized that just living with others is the only asceticism most of us ever need. And for these people from strikingly different backgrounds, with vastly differing aptitudes, interests, personal habits, and theological and political persuasions, it is a difficult discipline to pray, work, and play together in relative peace. One of the things that Benedict recommends in his rule is that monks pray the Lord's Prayer together, several times a day. He says it's in order to remove the thorns of contention that spring up in communal life. And Benedictines tell me that while this practice doesn't work wonders, it is good when we're sitting in choir with people who have pissed us off to be reminded that we are forgiven only as we forgive. The more I ask to be delivered from evil, one monk said, the more I realize that first of all, I have to attend to the evil that is in my heart. The Psalms are the core of monastic life, and I've come to believe that this immersion in the Psalms is the greatest tool Benedictines have in their struggle with evil. Over time, they come to know the truth of what the 4th century monk Athanasius said, that the Psalms act as a mirror. But they are a non-distorting mirror. They reflect human beings as we are. Every emotion is there, for good or ill. What strikes modern Americans as negative in the Psalms is often just a realistic portrayal of the evil that people perpetrate on one another, massacres, oppression, betrayal, and especially the desire for revenge. The Psalms are like that difficult and priceless friend who won't lie to us about the wrong we do or the wrong we harbor within ourselves. The Psalms as poems allow the soul considerable room for exploration. And as one Benedictine said, they allow God to behave in ways he can't behave in systematic theology. The Psalms also address essential questions. Why do the evil prosper and the innocent suffer? Why does this generation praise what is worthless? Why do people put their trust in despots and their hope in material gain? The Psalms have some answers. Put not your trust in riches, even when they increase. The great are an illusion. Take their breath and they come to nothing. Evil is its own reward. My enemy dug a pit for me and fell in it himself. But answers are not what the Psalms are about. I think the main thing they offer, and this all is something I really learned from hanging out with too many monks and nuns, the main thing they offer as ancient poems with an uncanny relevance to our current situation is evidence that God is still a mystery and that human evil and human suffering have not really changed much in 3,000 years. You can decide if that's cause for hope or not. I do know that when I could tear myself away from the terrible images on the TV on September 11th, I went straight to the Psalms. And when President Bush declared that America will rid the world of evil, the Psalms provided me with a response. Two, actually. An admonition, put not your trust in princes. Well, he is a prince. He's our prince. And a prayer, let the nations know they are but nations. The Psalms look at human experience through the lens of eternity, and I believe this may help explain why it was so many Benedictine communities and convent schools and institutions of other orders whose daily lives are centered on the Psalms were willing to hide Jews during the Holocaust. The Nazis and their sympathizers may have had all the power, but from the perspective of the Psalms, despots come and go, and temporal power is not what matters in the long run. I'm fascinated by the play of imagination that engaging the Psalms requires. Benedictines find it necessary to internalize the enemies spoken of there. When you come across an accusation, you love lies more than truth, or an image of enemies pregnant with malice who conceive evil and bring forth lies, you don't project it out on other people. You're tempted to. But you really begin to reflect on how these stark judgments are true of you. Eventually, though, you do come to realize that you can't spiritualize all the enemies away. The Psalms remind us that we do have enemies, people who wish us harm. But they also warn us that if we wish others ill and act in ways that oppress others, especially the most vulnerable people in a society, we become the enemy. I find that monastic people are more willing to address the subject of evil than many Christians who, so like many Americans, seem to feel that evil is just negative thinking and that talking it out in therapy will make it go away. The monastic approach could not be more different. Several Benedictines I talked to when I was writing the Cloister Walk, they put it in terms of almost embracing evil, observing and engaging it as it works its way through your thoughts. Not even resisting, but simply being attentive to it. Does it nurse past slights and swell with resentment? Does it prompt you toward an act of revenge? Does it turn into a desire for something you don't need? Or can you see a virtue hiding on its flip side and choose to act on that? When people engage in that, they're really practicing spiritual warfare, and that's a tradition at least as old as monasticism. It employs a psychology of temptation that bears little resemblance to what most of us learned in religious education about sin, as it comes from a time before there was a catalog of sins identified by the church. The concept of 7 deadly sins evolved very slowly, but it originated in the temptations towards evil that the early monks and nuns had experienced in themselves, which they eventually characterized as 8 bad thoughts. But by the time of my 1950s catechism classes in a congregational church, this existential sense of sin was lost to me. The whole idea of sin seemed abstract and somewhat foolish. It was easy to delude myself into thinking of evil as something I might succumb to one day, but I could probably avoid. If I didn't accumulate a lot of stuff, I wasn't greedy. If I didn't make out with boys, like the bad girls, lust was not a problem. But the monastic approach was an eye-opener for me. It looks at temptations rather than acts. The bad thoughts that are always distracting us, pulling us away from the present so that we indulge in anxiety or desire concerning events in the past or future. Have I ever been so struck with the fear of being helpless that I become obsessed with the hoarding of goods? I have encountered the bad thought of greed. Have I ever let a sexual fantasy take hold of me to such an extent that I ruined a real relationship? It's the bad thought of lust. Have I ever lamented over a lost time and place so that my present condition became intolerable to me? Welcome to the bad thought of despair. Have I ever started to pray and been overcome by the memory of the wrong another person has done to me? It's the thought of anger laying siege. In Amazing Grace, my 3rd book, Amazing Grace, A Vocabulary of Faith, I opened my chapter on the words good and evil by discussing the way people say so often, I'm a good person. It's usually a preface to dumping on someone they consider bad. I'm a good person. I don't eat meat. I don't cheat on my wife. I don't attack the president. I do attack the president. I'm a good person. I don't engage in homosexual acts. I'm a good person. I don't engage in homophobia. The litany of self-righteousness that pervades our culture says to me that for all of our psychological sophistication, we remain remarkably unreflective about ourselves and our capacity for evil. But the monastic perspective lets no one off the hook. Try this old desert story on for size, maybe substituting the word terrorist for murderer. Abba Pohlman said, if a man has attained to that which the gospel speaks of, to the pure all things are pure, he sees himself as less than all creatures. The young brother said, how can I deem myself less than a murderer? The old man said, when a man has really comprehended this saying, if he sees a man committing murder, he says, he has only committed this one sin, but I commit sins every day. How can I deem myself less than a terrorist? It's an offensive concept, but then monasticism is offensive. I sense that some people, when they think of evil, truly believe that they stand apart. They have nothing in common with evildoers. In fact, they pride themselves that they are not anything like the people who would do such things. A perspective that I find much more useful in my life and my work is sort of a continuum, basically moving from thought to action. An adulterer might casually note how convenient it would be if the spouse were no longer around. Such a thought can lead to actual murder, but more commonly it leads the adulterer to eliminate the spouse by acting as if he or she did not exist. Such a thought, though properly attended to, can move us back on the continuum, back into the realm of a good thought or a virtue. We might move from, how convenient if this person weren't here, to, my God, what am I thinking of? to a reconsideration of how we are changing the people closest to us. Shocked out of our self-indulgent reverie, we might actually become more capable of making a good decision about our relationships. But it's so easy to remain inattentive to our thoughts, and when evil has really taken hold of us, we can convince ourselves that the evil we are doing is good. Psalm 36 says it well. Sin whispers to sinners in the depths of their hearts. They so flatter themselves in their minds that they know not their guilt. In their mouths are mischief and deceit. All wisdom is gone. They plot the defeat of goodness as they lie in bed. I believe that any creative encounter with evil requires that we not distance ourselves from it. In order to write about evil, a writer has to try to comprehend it from the inside out, to understand the perpetrators and not necessarily sympathize with them. And one book I'd like to add, a book I think that does that remarkably well, is Joyce Carol Oates' novel Zombie. It's not a pleasant book to read, but it's an extraordinary novel about a mass murderer. You really come to understand why he's doing what he's doing. But Americans seem to have a very difficult time making a distinction between understanding and sympathizing. Somehow we believe that those who attempt to inform us about what leads to evil are attempting to explain it away. I believe that just the opposite is true, and when it comes to coping with evil, ignorance is our worst enemy. I'm going to conclude with a very brief poem on the subject of goodness. In fact, it's called Goodness. Despite our good deeds, the chatter of our best intentions, our many kindnesses, God is at work in us, close to the bone, past the sinews of our virtues, to the marrow we cannot feel, the sudden helpless tears when we know what we are and can go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Nathan Englander, please.
Good evening. I'm going to read you a short piece, a midrash. A midrash is a story based on a line in the Bible. I guess midrash is in the paper a lot now. A beit midrash is a house of learning, so it's the same word in Hebrew. But in this case, it's a sort of an agadah, like a legend based on a line of the Bible. But I guess I should say some things about evil first. And I was happy to hear about Satan with a small s, because unlike, I guess, dueling, the good versus evil in the world, I think I myself wrestle with evil versus evil. That's I was raised very, very religious, and now I'm very, very not religious. And I guess I was left with a superstitious form of evil. I could talk a lot more about evil in writers than evil in writing. That's sort of my fear. That's the kind of evil I really believe in. I was very happy to meet the first writer who was a true hero, who I thought maybe wouldn't go to heaven, because then I knew God might strike you down, but he doesn't mess with the fiction, basically. Anyway, so yeah, now I'm sounding like Woody Allen, but that's basically what I am, is an atheist with a real fear of a divine retribution on this earth. But we were asked to talk about respond to evil in our fiction, and unlike the other authors, I have my whole body of work right here, so that was an easy answer. But honestly, having left the world, having left that black and white world, I feel very much lost in the gray. I'm always in the gray. I really do feel, there is good and evil, but that's only in the world. I don't think there is a true force of evil. I find the pure form is really only mustered, and I guess to serve religion and state. That's the only time. I mean, I live in New York. I guess I'm announcing that now, but I've been in Jerusalem for the last 5 years, where the word evil gets bandied about and it sort of loses its meaning. If both, you're on a bus and half the people think Sharon is evil and the other half think Arafat is evil, and in its purest living form, and that's right now the conflict we have, where, Osama bin Laden uses evil to serve religion, Bush is pure evil, and vice versa to serve state. But in fiction, I don't really think there's room for a pure evil, or it's of no interest. I really tried to think. I looked at my own book, which has, a story set under Stalin, who I softened, and a story set under Hitler, who I made a ghost Hitler, because there's not really, in that world, room for it. I'm more interested, evil is a force, I'm interested in how people function. Evil, for me, is a question of humanity, how people function under it. If you're really going to deal with the pure form, then I think it's looking how people live, under, a group of Jews under Nazism, a group of writers under Stalin. That's really the interest. I was trying to think, and this was the exact, if zombie has been raised, but I think a sociopath or a psychopath is different than a purely evil person. And I really couldn't think. I was trying to think of all the books I love, and they really all, when a pure evil is there, it ends up this umbrella evil that people live under. Like, if I can anthropomorphize, and again, not as much as our president who said evil doesn't celebrate Christmas in the Times last week, more or less. But that, if I can call a plague evil, but people living under the plague or the trial. For me, when I think of evil in the world, it ends up being injustice, I guess, and it's probably sort of an Orwellian Room 101. That's my being wrongly arrested. There's my fear if anyone wants to play a joke. But so all the books I love, if it's about an evil character like Crime and Punishment, there is no book with pure evil. It's not a question. It's no interest. And I really kept racking my brain trying to find a pure evil character. And I went back to the Old Testament because there's a pretty good and vengeful God there. And I even there I couldn't muster it, and I sort of found my answer thinking back to the Bible. Basically, since I'm reading a Midrash, I guess I'll talk about that for a second. But I thought about Pharaoh. If we're talking about oppressive, what's in the news. But if we're talking about enslaving populations and oppressing people in a pure form of oppression, and all the good stories I was raised on, that the Jews did not build the pyramids, by the way, but nonetheless, that the Jewish babies were forced into the pyramid, and the slaying of children, and this ruthlessness. And I thought, why is of my favorite biblical story, the second one being Kings, I really like the David and Bathsheba story. I like that one. But the other one I like, the Pharaoh story, is wonderful. And I said, if he was purely evil, it would be of no interest. You wouldn't need 10 plagues, you'd need one plague. If there's a pure evil, stick a knife in his eye and it's done. It's justified. And then I remembered these are one of the lines that stuck there, but Vaniakshe et lev paro, like I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And there's not much future tense in the Bible. But I thought for us to have, even in the Bible, to have an empathetic character in Pharaoh, this idea, we have someone who does evil things, but in the end, it's this very clear line where God says, I am going to harden his hearts. I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And the idea, if he had hardened his own heart, it'd be no story. And I thought about that, even in this case of an extreme evil, it's God that does the heart, so we are forced to empathize. And then I, thought back to my black and white, and I thought this is, again, evil in the service of religion, of a pure good and evil. But the books aren't that way. The religion itself, because then I started to think about Jewish tradition and what follows the 10 plagues and the drowning of the Egyptians. It's basically, I guess most of you probably know, that a glass gets broken at a Jewish wedding, and this, one of the things that what it represents is the destruction of Jerusalem, that we never have a pure joy. We always have to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. Something gets broken, even under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy. And then in this same case, actually, which I thought, because I see the Bible as literature now, which is always a hard class to teach at college, because there's always the religious kids fighting when you take Bible as literature, and all the major religions represented and screaming out from the back. I say, I know, we have to go on. Anyway, but nonetheless, I see it as literature, but it's, to religious Jews, it is but the Word of God. And so how does that story continue on in tradition? And I thought about it. On Passover, we say the Hallel prayer, which is a prayer of joy. And I thought this was really nice, now as we try to have a war and drop bombs and food at the same time. But we say a half Hallel. You say half, the prayer is cut in half on Passover, because we're, after just running from the Egyptians, but because of so many Egyptians died, in the destruction of Egypt. You only say half the prayer because we must empathize. We can't be truly joyous if people have died. Anyway, so I thought, there's some thoughts on evil. I'm going to read my short piece. Sip. It's called Clearing God's Name. God planted a garden in Eden to the east and placed there the man whom he had formed. Genesis 2:8. There is a common misconception about the order of things. When the earth was tohu bohu, and up did not have the slightest inclination to separate from down, and wet did not intend to give way to dry, God looked earthward with Adam at his side. I will send you to that place, said God. I don't want to go, Adam told him. God began to lift the sky from under the sea. The roiling mass tried to hold its formlessness, earth clinging to the hand of God, trailing up toward the sky until it could go no further, the mountains born from failure. I will not go, insisted Adam. God laughed. It was only the start, a jesseling of the canvas. With a giant spoon of stone, God scooped out the oceans, scraped out the lakes, and, as if considering a half-eaten slice of custard pie, turned the spoon over and scratched out all the rivers of the world. Adam was not impressed. For Adam, he added color to the fish in the sea, placed billy goats on rocky ledges, and added to the ibex a second horn. Still, Adam refused to descend. Eternity piled onto itself as the discussion continued, as God, laughing all the while, spruced up his little world. He hung fruit from the trees, hid milk inside coconuts and the udders of cows, turned some bees into hummingbirds and half the mice into bats. Still, Adam would not go down. God put lightning in the clouds, then thunder to chase after it. He taught the chameleons to hide and hinge the armadillo's once solid shell. All this was for his own entertainment as much as Adam's. He knew what offer must be made. Keep your stubbornness. You can go about your business without any interference. I will go then, said Adam. God placed Adam on earth, his body atop a hillock, his weight flattening the long virgin grass, the air around him at its sweetest, simply for never having been breathed by man before. But Adam would not awaken. God, that one and only time, came down to earth. He sat on the right side of Adam at the top of that hill and whispered into his ear, entreated him most politely to come alive. There will be ostriches, he said, and ospreys and aardvarks in sun showers. A warm rain began, and the new animals, unafraid, sniffed the feet of the body, not dead but not born to life. God started the flowers pollinating and put a moon in the sky that would, throughout time, occasionally eclipse the sun. He made it so stars were not eternal. He sent meteors flying, started the sun spinning, and gave all the birds teeth. Looking up at the sky, God decided against the last two. He stopped the sun in its place and took the teeth from the mouths of the birds and gave them to the fish who were already blessed with brilliant color. The birds became jealous, and God gave them feathers without a second thought. He was most concerned with man. Finally, he said, there will be Eve. He fashioned her right there on the hill and placed her at Adam's left side. She waited in a most peaceful fashion to be woken into the world. Obstinate and unalive, Adam offered no welcome, no commentary on the weather or the pleasant sensation of resting in the sharp, cool grass. Adam had become shrewd at God's side. He had learned that dawn and dusk threw the same shadows, though they fell on opposite sides of the tree. He had learned also that good and evil were a single force, just as rain, if God deems it, will flood the bounty it creates. It was only in his image, with a sin for every kindness, a decision in every deed, that Adam was willing to walk the land. But God, so in love with his new earth and his man and his woman, and excited like any father for all the joy to come, did not want to see pain in the eyes of his children. He did not want to hear the endless crying as night moved in a circle around the globe. He was only trying to protect them. Fine, he said reluctantly. Fine, Adam. What is freedom without choice? You may have it. God pressed his lips against Adam's ear to whisper into it the last of the gifts. There will be evil, Adam. You may have evil as well as good. And Adam knew this to mean that he was free, a God himself, a maker of choices, that the future was no longer closed. Adam opened an eye and rolled over toward Eve, placed a hand on her shoulder to wake her, a kiss on that shoulder to welcome her to life, his head light, still dizzy with that first long breath. God then went back forever to heaven. I only tell you this to set the story straight out of fairness to God. For it is time that the misconception was corrected, that God's name was finally cleared of guilt. In the beginning, on a hill, it was man who first turned his back on the Lord. Thank you.
Thank you. We all have mics, right? So we can continue the conversation this way. I'd like to alert people to microphones on the floor and invite everybody to be ready to leap in and to make the conversation go. I'm only one of you listening and trying to make sense of it all. It seems to me all of our storytellers have basically sort of copped a plea here. They're saying it wasn't they who invented this evil as evil, the capital E, evil, and I'm frankly wondering whether we should let them off the hook. If the storytellers of the world didn't come up with this kind of embodiment of it all, who in the world did, and who are we going to blame for this sense of a capital E, evil? But let me sort of go the low road to politics right away. President Bush, George W. Bush, has continued the Ronald Reagan tradition of speaking of our foreign enemies as evil, the empire of evil, and now a war against evil. Several questions here, but the first one is simply, where does this come from? And is it an American, is it a peculiarly, of course Osama bin Laden is playing the same game now, but is it an American failing that we do this thing? I also want to say, and I don't mean to load it up too much against President Bush, but sort of no candidate that I can remember, including Jimmy Carter, sort of wore Jesus Christ on his sleeve quite as aggressively as George W. Bush did when he spoke of his primary teacher in political philosophy. He said it was Jesus Christ. And I'm not trying to be fresh, but we haven't heard any of that since 9/11, and I wonder if we should have. But let me put the question this way. Would there have been another way for a great imperial nation like ours to respond to the attack of 9/11 without making it us good against you guys evil? Joyce Carol Oates, I mean, how might it have been done?
No, I really don't understand your question that well. Could you repeat the whole thing? I'm sitting here and thinking. I'm sitting here and thinking that evil is basically a word, and people sort of bat it around like a ping pong ball. You know, it's your turn, it's my turn. To me, if there's any evil, and I'm not sure that evil is the right word, it was the great act of the 20th century is the Holocaust. Beyond that, around that, next to that, everything else is pretty trivial. Now, I'm not sure that evil even applies to that, you know, in terms of the big E. It seems to me that there are specific human beings who implemented it, and historically there are reasons that they would rationalize, but that it's a very human kind of phenomenon. And then when we reach for abstractions, that we're sort of just reaching for stereotypes. Obviously, Bush is following his speechwriters, and he's saying things that are, I would guess, cued to the American public. Every president does that, including Clinton. I mean, especially including Clinton. But I think all of us who were speaking were sort of indicating, I heard Kathleen say, you know, the evils that you encounter in Dakota, in these so-called ordinary people, that I'm so much more comfortable with the idea of evils, which means dissension, disharmony. Somebody's got a lot of adrenaline or testosterone, you know, and basically it's an instinct for combat in human beings.
And I think, you know, I think the testosterone factor in 9/11 was pretty strong. I mean, I don't want any pregnant women at my grave. You know, I mean, very strange. And here are people, he had a gym membership in Florida and was exercising with women, the poor thing, you know. I mean, you just kind of wonder the kind of, and he hated skyscrapers. I'm fascinated by this story. If I ever write a novel, maybe I'll use this guy, because here was a guy studying urban planning, you know, which is a wonderful subject. But his thesis was on the superiority of traditional Muslim architecture, which is sort of low-key and subtle, and the evils of skyscrapers. You know, I mean, all of this. And one of the things that did strike me politicians always say stupid things. I mean, that's almost what we elect them for, I think, as to say dumb things. But one of the things that struck me was that George Bush and everyone down, the governors and mayors, were very adamant about saying the Islamic religion is not evil. This is not our enemy. And making that very, very clear. And everywhere, all over the country, Islamic representatives were there with rabbis and priests and pastors and Wiccans and everyone else, you know, participating in these, you know, services of remembrance and healing. I thought that was really, really striking because after Pearl Harbor, that's not what happened. All Japanese, whether they were American citizens or not, were identified as enemy aliens by executive order. So, I mean, presidential order. So there was something that was very good in our response that wasn't there 60 years ago at Pearl Harbor. So I was somewhat encouraged by that.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm back to Jerusalem, back to America. I mean, I became a flag-waving American before everyone was flag-waving in Israel because I saw how important democracy is and separation of church and state. I mean, one thing that made me nervous there was everything that, you know, large elements of the government who make... I don't want, you know, speaking of urban planning, that the sewer system to be... those decisions to be made based on the coming of the Messiah. That's you know, people who are truly religious know these are separate things, that we're on this earth and have to plan this way. So every time I hear about evil, I get itchy. Every time we had a blow against evil in Jerusalem, I would crawl further under the bed because we'd blow up someone in their town and then my neighborhood blows up again on our blow against evil. So yeah, I don't like to hear this talk at all. It's very frightening to me because it's, you know, it's a pretty endless, you know, I honestly hope everything being said is not believed by the people who are saying it. I really hope they're talking because they think that's what we want to hear. Because there are real decisions to be made, and there, you know, how not to have a cycle like this. You know, when I saw, but you know, when I saw I mean, I was in New York for September 11th, and when one tower went, and you know. The Beit-Lead bombing, 1995, it was large scale, it's the same structure. There's the sucker bomb, and then all the emergency workers come in, and then I could have told you the second, you know, you live with these things, and I know one thing is that it's a cycle we don't want to start just for the most selfish reasons, because I want to go to the movie theater and not worry. So yeah, I just hope it's rhetoric.
I want to ask one question. I hope it's not impertinent, but and then let's all plunge in here. But it has struck me in this whole aftermath that in terms of storytelling, in terms of evil, one of the fundamental sort of obstacles, one of the stones in all of our shoes is the David and Goliath story. And I want to ask you basically, was Goliath evil? The problem with the David and Goliath story is, first of all, that everybody knows it, and secondly, in almost any sort of mapping of this event, and comparing it with David and Goliath, we're Goliath. I mean, we are Goliath in the world today. There's no two ways about it. It's not even Pearl Harbor time.
Nobody pictures themselves.
It was an evil attack. What?
Nobody pictures themselves as Goliath ever.
Well, exactly.
We won't do it.
And nobody ever roots for him either. That seems to me that's the fundamental problem sort of politically in the world, that we're all, everyone even in this room, trained and conditioned to root for David. The guy that sucker punches the bad guy with a slingshot. In this case, Goliath didn't die. Goliath is in the recovery room. He's still there. But we have a hard time dealing. We weren't the bad guys in that attack, but we can't help thinking of us as the colossus that bestrides the world. How do we get around this? And is there any way to rethink, or as Goliath rethinks, is there any way to rethink him?
Well, first of all, I think the metaphor is a little awkward because Goliath didn't or doesn't give billions and billions of dollars of aid to all the Davids. And why are we all,
He doesn't get billions and billions of profits either.
but why are we always, the United States is held to some extraordinarily high standard? I think we probably behave pretty well in terms of history. No, I just don't see the metaphor of David and Goliath. I think maybe there are other metaphors that might work, but it's not one I feel comfortable with.
I do think maybe other people do see it like that way. The Palestinians who were
They do.
celebrating, we're the little guy, this is the big guy, we hit a blow. I mean, I can understand how they would think that. But Nathan hit on something I think that's really very interesting about us, is that we are not a religious state. A few idiots still say we're a Christian nation, but it's never been true. And it's certainly less true now than it might have been when my grandparents were growing up and being raised. And I think that is one of the things that is most offensive to very extreme Muslims, fundamentalists, Jewish fundamentalists, everything else. We are not a theocracy. And to a lot of people in the world, that is terribly offensive. And it seems to certainly have offended the terrorists who attacked the Trade Center and the Pentagon.
But would they like us better if we were completely Christian?
You know,
can't
they
see
might,
that.
in a way. Oddly enough, I wouldn't be surprised if they would respect that more. But I think our whole mentality is so, that whole separation of church and state is so important to us, and it's so much part of who we are. But I think for a lot of extremists in the world, that's what makes us weak in their eyes, or evil.
Nathan, did you want to?
Oh, I thought my interrupting you counted as my
Say it.
answer. I'll stick with that, though, really, that we're just going to hammer ourselves into whatever the old metaphor. I mean, that's Israel. The Palestinians do see themselves as, as the David fighting the fifth nuclear superpower, and Israel sees itself as the David and does the whole Arab world. So that's the rhetoric's already been introduced. So we talk about Al-Qaeda spread over 60 countries. We're going to make it bigger than us because we need it to be bigger than us for the... I just want us to figure out some new metaphors. I feel like, our sending over guys in army uniforms, it's it's like the redcoats lining up to fight in Vietnam. I think we need to, I think everyone says I come back to America, everyone says think outside the box. So I'll say that.
Speaking of thinking outside the box, last question for me. Nathan, what is the difference in terms of thinking about evil in going from a very, very religious perspective on life to a very, very not religious perspective on life?
Is that God bless a religious education? I have, it's almost like a secret, it's like being a Mason or something. We have a secret handshake of anyone who had a religious education, whatever the religion, if you've left it, because it's hardwired. The synapses just fire a certain way. So, personally, I will always think of evil the same way, that, in terms of my personal punishment. But I've deconstructed it. In terms of the rest of the world, I've really deconstructed it. It's exactly as I've already said, which I just think it's, it's rhetoric. You're not going to have a pure form of, or a universal form of evil that everyone agrees is evil.
I have a question for Nathan. Now, I really don't know the answer, but isn't it the case that Judaism did not have a tradition of demonizing its enemies quite so much as Christianity?
Just because there's too many, we have to spread the energy out. But that's why I think.
In the very beginning.
Yeah, and religion's mixed. I think that's it. Where I really did have a fire and brimstone education, but I think the text-wise, no. That's why I was happy to hear you're small. I remember learning the Gemara, the Talmud, and seeing Satan coming in exactly as a side character. This is.
But also, Jews were not eager.
Well, we had we didn't even have heaven and hell. There was the limbo.
Right.
That was when King Saul goes to talk to Solomon, or vice versa.
But that's so important with Christians. You're damned or you're saved. But also, as I understand it, Jews were not terribly interested in converting other people.
No. That's
but
always
Christianity and Islam are very, very concerned with conversion.
Yeah, proselytizing. I think it's the Reform movement decided to announce they were going to do it, and it was huge waves.
That's a profound difference between the religions, a kind of, the military attitude, messianic attitude.
Evil is a game that any number can play, and I'd like to invite everybody here to plunge in. There are microphones at the front on either side, and just step right up. Not yet. Keep talking. Keep trying.
Okay. This one is working. Can I?
You go first then, and
Okay.
we'll work on the other
All
one.
right, thank you. My name is Paul Mariani, professor of English at Boston College. Good evening, Kathleen. Thank you very much tonight for all of you for the dialogue and for confusing me more than ever. I was wondering if I noticed that most of the questions so far have really dealt with the political side of evil, the global side of evil, and returned to Osama bin Laden and September 11th. And I thought maybe just for a moment we could turn the coin 180 degrees and maybe just look at the other side. I'm concerned about the myth, if you will, if you want to call it that, of what happens in Genesis in the Garden of Eden. And you're all writers, and you've already, Nathan, you've already, in a sense, rewritten Genesis, and which is fine. I mean, that's what writers are for. But I'm curious. If we forget about evil in the other person, if we look away from that for a moment, and hypothetically look at evil in ourselves and ask, what happened in the garden that, and to read it, that tells us something about ourselves. I'm thinking of two things. I'm thinking of the knowledge that came with the eating of the fruit. The knowledge of good and evil, and subsequent death. And secondly, what happens shortly after the expulsion from that garden, where one brother kills another one. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps look at evil from a personal perspective and give us some insight into what you think evil is from that side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll start in, fools rush in, but I think the character that fascinates me the most is Eve, and in a sense, she's the first biblical interpreter, and gives us that gift. And one of the things that really got me thinking about her, the first time I attended the Catholic Easter liturgy, in the very first part of that liturgy, there's this song, the Exultet, in which we thank Eve, because without her, none of the rest of this would be here. So her act of disobedience has turned into something quite wonderful. So I guess I would start there, that's one of those stories where there is no complete good, no complete evil. It's very complex and very ambiguous. And that sometimes we start out all wrong. We do the very one thing that, the fairy tale says, don't do that, and that's the one thing you do, and somehow it all comes out right in the end. And I think that's where I would start with that.
My interpretation of it is somewhat different. I see it as a cautionary tale to a certain genre. Pandora's Box is perhaps as famous. These are cautionary tales that are usually, I think, invented or concocted. They're told by older people to younger people. Basically, it's very conservative politics. Pandora's Box and the Garden of Eden, I was going to say the Garden of Eve, almost a fragrance that. They're basically about, I think, somewhat patriarchal societies keeping the lid down, women, Pandora's Box especially. It seems to me that eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil would be a good thing. Knowledge in itself must be a good thing, except older generations are kind of resistant to the idea, which is inevitable. It's just Darwinian evolution. Younger generations are going to supplant us. But the cautionary tales, if you look at all of them, they're all conservative politically. And they tell you, be quiet, or they tell you, keep your mouth shut, or don't eat the apple, and don't open the box, and so forth, because those people have already done it.
And look what happened.
Thank you. Nathan, the question was to you originally.
I very much, if I'm allowed to agree, I agree. But that's, I think it's Gary Rensberg. I don't want to steal anyone's work, but a professor I had in college who teaches at Cornell, I think, where I didn't go. But anyway, I need a blackboard and Genesis, but I think it really was just a map, a social map. There's two creation stories if you look at it in Genesis. There's a second creation, and you can almost see the melding from the tribal system to the king system in terms of how those passages break down. It was what was needed as a social contract. So I think, it's, that whole, I think it makes for guilt, which we need in a society, just not so much of it.
Yep.
Still not working. I think the line forms over here now.
I've never heard so much pussyfooting around in my life. You know, this reminds me of a discussion in the early 50s of sex. You know, everybody's saying, oh, God, evil, oh, we don't have it in our house, you know, we don't have it in our place, you know. It's just unbelievable. So, we have Kathleen Norris, who's been in the Benedictine community, which I actually happen to know quite a bit about. My name is Catherine Powers. I'm the daughter of J.F. Powers, who was there. And what you don't know is what went on. The people who were kicked out of their houses, the garbage plant, there's a lot you don't know. Joyce Carol Oates, who has an academic view of evil. Maybe you have, you know, your own kind of insulation from the world. You, Nathan, I don't know anything.
That's good. I'm insecure enough as it is.
Well, but you didn't let me take care of you.
Woody Allen.
I mean, the question is, if it had not been evil, but badness, would that have made a difference? The badness that people do? I mean, really, concrete. You're talking about as if it were angels dancing on how many? On the top of a pin. You know, okay. Would it make a difference?
We've been talking about sort of...
The question is, would it make a difference if it were badness rather than evil?
Yeah, but is it the badness that people do or the badness that does people is the question.
People. I mean, all that exists is people, right?
It's part of the question.
First of all, I had the great honor of knowing your father and loving him, and he actually made history at St. John's because he walked across the street and came to a poetry reading I gave at the Ecumenical Institute, and everyone said, J.F. Powers is here, and I'm going, oh my God. You know, but I went over to his house a few times, and he gave my husband a ride in his battered old car, and I got to know him. But actually, I did hear some of those stories about terrible things that had gone on at St. John's in the past and in the present from Benedictines themselves. And I think that's one of the things I meant about them is that they're not perfect and they certainly know it. And they will tell stories about bad things that their communities have done that they themselves have done. So I think my own experience of a lot of different communities is that they're just a little more willing to address that in themselves than a lot of other people I know. So that's kind of what I meant. I wasn't certainly trying to romanticize Benedictines because they would kick me if I did that.
What about if you...
But badness, I guess the word, I don't know. I mean, the word badness, I think the word evil is just more provocative, and I think kind of, we're talking semantics here now. I like the word evil more. I think it's a more evocative word for me.
Badness is the childlike form. You call a child bad. It's evil in training. You know.
Well, you wouldn't say the Holocaust was a bad thing. You know, there's a lurid glamour to the concept of evil.
Please.
I'm Sister Callista Roy, Boston College School of Nursing. I wanted to go back to the theme that's come up several times that relates to the evil that is in each of us, and ask a question. Two sort of messages we're hearing, or two of the many messages that we're hearing about, the early 21st century, that perhaps we're not in a war against terrorism, but rather against absolute ideologies. So whether it be religion, whether it be capitalism, whatever, but that somehow we're called in the modern world to figure out a way where we have unity and diversity at the same time. So that's one question, is that although we don't eliminate evil, but perhaps somehow our current generation comes to terms with it by trying to figure out a way that there's not an absolute ideology. It's not Christianity, it's not Islam, it's not Judaism, but somehow, or any set of political beliefs. And then the second layer of that is it's not a war against terrorism, but it's a war against what they're calling the roots of terrorism, the injustices, the small evils that you're talking about, poverty, hunger around the world, 2/3 of the world hungry, etc. So if any of the panel could address either of those issues as a way of looking at evil.
Is that a question?
There is a question there.
I do think that the 20th century has shown us, I mean, through works like Orwell's work, and through our own experience, the Holocaust, and so many of the events of the last 50 years, that ideology is evil. I mean, it is really, when people cling to one ideology as the one thing, you end up banning music and making women veil themselves and making all men grow beards to a certain length or they get beaten in the streets. I mean, that's ideology at work, but it could be any ideology. And I think that's one lesson of the 20th century that I hope we've learned.
But they don't think of themselves as evil.
No, of course not.
They perceive themselves as being very pure. They're sort of puritanical and very good.
And that's always the case with
that's
ideology.
a problem. If we say we're good and they say they're good, it's just a matter of semantics.
No, but I'm not saying we're good. I'm saying that ideology, I think, is the
any
enemy.
ideology.
Any ideology.
Even
when you carry it to an extreme.
But not democracy. We tend to feel that our own ideology is benign. And yet you can conceive of a world, of chaotic world, of very ill-educated people in which democracy maybe wouldn't work,
I mean, does your ideology affect others? That's the simple, how can others live under it? That's what I always argue in Jerusalem, Under democracy, there's room for me and the religious guy in Jerusalem. Under theocracy, there's no room for me. Because I'm going to say, I'm going to end up saying that extremism is dangerous, but I think this is a table of fanatics. I mean, my whole life is fiction. I have no day, no night. I'm compulsive. That's all I have. But I am an extremist. But it doesn't really bother anyone except, maybe my girlfriend.
Yes. My name is David Hollenbach, and I teach in the theology department at Boston College. I think you've been far too easy on the experience of the realities of evil, and plural, realities of evil, that we've seen. The 20th century that we've been through is the bloodiest century in human history. The Holocaust, massive evil. The First World War wasn't so bad either, if you're looking for really inhuman slaughter of large numbers of people. 1995, I was in Rwanda, a year and a half after the genocide took place, and there were still piles of corpses that I saw with my eyes there. Now, Kathleen said, when we know what we are and can still go on, if the 20th century has taught us something about what we are, not about God or somebody else, but about us, it should have taught us that we have something to be really worried about. And the question is, how in the face of that kind of experience can we do anything else than be massively defensive against each other? And if we are massively defensive against each other, we're going to end up doing it over and over and over again. We need something more than just saying, oh, well, look how bad it's been in the 20th century, shape up. We need something more than that. We need something that we can trust that goes beyond that kind of capacity for evil. In other words, I think we need a faith in a God who is beyond not that kind of human engagement, but who is in some sense in compassion and solidarity with the human struggle. That's where I think the issue of belief and unbelief finally comes home to roost. Is the ultimate framework in which we're living friendly or an enemy? And if it's an enemy, we're really in trouble. I'd like to know what you think in that framework about the context of what we've learned from the 20th century.
Good question, obviously.
Well, I think we'd all like to believe in a God who transcends divisions and ethnic differences, and I can't imagine anyone would not think that was an excellent idea.
And I think, and I think genocide is probably as old as the human race. And that's why I specifically mentioned tribalism in my talk. I'm talking about tribalism in a tiny little town in the Great Plains, but I think it does translate into all sorts of, in Afghanistan, Rwanda, all sorts of places that you can, it is one of the primary evils that I think that we're up against in the world, is tribalism of all sorts. And I hope we've learned something from the 20th century, but I'm not sure.
Well, the two essential visions, one is a kind of, maybe it's an esoteric vision, that might be a tragic vision that you garner from the great works of art, like Shakespeare's tragedies, and certainly Homer's Iliad, which is the great work of war. And it's a beautiful, brilliant, heart-rending work, the Iliad. When you're done reading it, you are completely exhausted, and it sort of takes your heart out, because it seems to be the very emblem of all our struggles through the centuries and millennia. But it's a tragic vision. And tragic visions don't have any political resonance. To have a political state, you have to be optimistic. You have to simplify. You have to, in a sense, pretend you don't know that probably history replicates itself in tragedy. And you end up having then to vote for somebody. It becomes very simplified, and the slogans become rhetorical. So I think that's one of the problems we're having this evening, that the three of us are maybe trained, or by temperament, we tend to see complexities and ambiguities, and we're interested in the human perspective. But then to look at evil in a large scale, we have to somehow pretend that it's simple, that there might be a simple, overarching God who could unite everybody. And that's why we're having a little, I think, difficulty in communicating.
Well, but it's an important question, and I think Father Hollenbeck and others are sort of unsatisfied by this dividing of evil into little evils of poverty and illiteracy and whatnot, or relativizing it, or making it too ambiguous and complex, when people, I expect even you, feel that there's a monster at the gates, and that we're getting closer and closer. How do we satisfy that fundamental anxiety?
Differently. Like this is, a leader of the, religious community. That's the whole point. I think you need to see evil that way. That's your job in this world, and, mine is to, suffer angst constantly. I miss that. I was a religious person, and I will forever miss yes and no. I said that at the beginning. That's all I can tell you, but I don't believe there, I don't believe in that form of evil anymore. It's gone. So I spend all day wondering, building little terrariums and putting people in the laboratory and poking at them. That's. So yeah, I think it's sort of an existential. I'm much calmer in Israel. I really almost could have lost my mind from bringing my Western mentality, bringing separate mentalities. The only thing that calmed me in Israel was that I made the same mistake Clinton did, where in all good faith he brought a Western mentality to a non-Western place. And the more fluent I got, the more confused I got, because it didn't even sound like another language to me anymore. It's a different needs, different beliefs, and I really think that's it. For me, I feel much better, after I moved back to New York, and this all starts here, and I feel much better now that I think there is evil in the world. That's why my journalist friends are so damn calm. I just got back from, Afghanistan, I play soccer with all these journalists. They're fearless because I think they accept, you talk about that pile of bodies. I have a friend, she's a journalist. She walks by the pile of bodies, but I swear she can't walk by a puppy. If she went to the Sudan, she'd bring back a puppy from the Sudan and step over starving children, because this is how she survives.
Well, take two radically different visions. I spoke of Homer's Iliad. But there's also John Milton's Paradise Lost. And in Paradise Lost, it's very definite. Satan is evil, and God is very good. I mean, he's completely tyrannical and good. And there's Jesus. You know, it's basically a kind of cautionary tale again. But some of us find Homer, who doesn't placate and doesn't really have any answers at all, we just find temperamentally that we're drawn to that kind of vision of the world. I'm not saying it's a beautiful vision. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's very terrifying. The Odyssey is maybe a little more hopeful in that it posits values and the kind of family and coming back home. And you murder a lot of people when you get back home, as Odysseus does. He slaughters the suitors, then he sort of settles in. And so it's a little more of a happy ending. But basically, you know, if you want people to have these beliefs, then you have to invite those people to be on the panel to express those beliefs. And, you know, you invited the people you invited. And so that's, and there you are. It's a problem in casting.
Let me say one thing. As someone who tried to avoid my religion for years and years, but I really have a hopelessly religious sensibility. One of the most powerful experiences I had during the week of September 11th was going on Wednesday morning to the little Eucharist at the little Episcopal church across the street where I've been going and sort of making my community in Honolulu. And I walk in the church and there's a cross, and I usually just look at it and say, that's a cross. You know, I don't think much about it. And that morning I just knelt down there and I really felt, probably more powerfully than I've ever felt, that Christ was there on the cross and he was with all of us, you know. And that was a powerful faith experience. But you see, as a writer, I have to assume that most of my readers don't have that belief, have never had that experience, and I need to be able to write about it or talk about it in a way that anyone can understand it. And with a Jewish editor, actually, she makes it a lot easier for me when I'm writing Christian books, because she says, what do you mean by that? You mean Christ was once alive or is still living? I go, okay, that's been great, but I mean, that's the challenge for me as a writer. So that's the kind of thing that might take me a long time to write about it in a short story, or, but I didn't come here to give a testimonial. I just gave one, but that's not why I came here. I came to address an audience of people of all kinds of backgrounds and faiths and beliefs.
But it is a matter of faith.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, ultimately, it's a matter of
faith. And that's why it's so hard to write about for me, because I don't want to address a Christian audience. I want to address a general audience. So you have to find the right way to do that.
Thank you.
I'm
Father?
Brinton Likes, and it's getting to be a role here with Boston College in the Lynch School of Education. And I think I'd like to follow up on some of this conversation, coming at it more from the perspective of the public intellectual or the public artist. All of you spoke in one way or another about the need to look inside, and also about the differences between, or the gaps between, the intellectual, the academic, the person who lives life in its complexities, and the sound bites that our president has been feeding us. I think in some ways some of the dis-ease and the questions are, what is the role of the artist, the public intellectual, in creating different metaphors or creating different symbols for those who live in this space of belief and non-belief in the contemporary world at a moment of crisis such as we've experienced on September the 11th here in the United States, but other parts of the world are experiencing. That is there a way of moving between some of these worlds, whether it's the two cultures that you described in Jerusalem or the multicultural experiences of many of us? And does the artist have a contribution to make in that discourse? Do we have to reduce it to sound bites in order to find new metaphors, new symbols? Thank you.
Symbols in place of sound bites.
I'll take a swing. But I just think it's not at all a concern of what I do. I'm still amazed that I'm sitting up here and you're sitting out there, because just trying to tell a story. I mean, I think it's the idea of people then look into the stories and hopefully something else, anything that's in there, whatever you find in there, God bless. But really, I think for me, I'm just trying to tell a story, and I'm really worried about that world. So yeah, I don't ever even entertain those and worry about them when they filter in, even if I'm, read the Times too much.
Well, I can answer it in a sort of personal way. When I write a novel, which has a certain scope, I might take a number of people through time and space for a good portion of their lives. Say I'm writing a novel about upstate New York. It's set in Niagara Falls between 1950 and 1978, which is what I'm doing. And I'm focusing on that extraordinary phenomenon that's known as Love Canal. I've done some research into that, and you've probably heard about it. And basically, I'm writing about how a man who's a lawyer, who's well-intentioned, he didn't mean to get involved, but he takes up what we would call today a class action suit. They were basically not, this just didn't happen in the 1950s. Love Canal, was a toxic waste dump, but it wasn't acknowledged to be so, and a school was built on it, and a subdivision was built on it, and people became very ill. And that was evil enough, but then politicians and others, chemical manufacturers, capitalists, they denied that this was going on. So these people who were very ill, women having miscarriages, children were coming down with leukemia, people having brain tumors, they'd go to doctors, and the doctors would say, well, you've been smoking too much, or you've been watching too much television. That can do that, give you a brain tumor. So I would explore this in a myriad of ways that were very human, and I, in a way, would be pointing to, I guess, the capitalist motive, the selfishness, the consumer ethic. But I wouldn't be erecting a devil, or a large force of evil. It would be more that there's something about the corporate mentality, or there's something about large social entities that tend to deny the human. Now, after many years, I think it was 1978, the first symptoms began in the 1950s. In 1978, there was a court case, and finally there was some action was taken, and President Jimmy Carter in 1980 declared Love Canal a disaster area, which meant that people could be their property would be bought and they could leave and so forth. But many of them were actually dead at that point. So, this is how I approach the subject, and I'm a storyteller also, and basically I love to tell a story, and I love drama, and I love the interplay of characters, but I would set it in a world in which there are contentions, and nobody thinks that he's evil. These are investors, they have stock, they own stock in these companies and so forth. They just think that they're doing what they need to do. Then the people who are good, they wouldn't even, they'd be embarrassed to think that they were, carrying a banner called good. They're acting in very good and selfless ways, but I see them as human and involved in a human drama. And it's a kind of social parable of our time. And now, in the 21st century, we have environmental laws, and so things have been moving in that direction. So there's a kind of evolving good that came out of these evils.
And I'll just add a little bit. I do think that you are more likely to find some solace and sort of sanity in poetry and fiction now. I think that's an important resource. I found myself, after I consulted the Psalms and the Book of Lamentations, Jeremiah's marvelous work, I did go to some poems. I went to John Donne's Death Be Not Proud, Walt Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which, is just sort of made that whole part of New York come alive for me, and in ways that I needed after September 11th. And I just think maybe looking to poets and fiction writers from centuries beyond and contemporary works, I think, is more likely to give us better perspective than what we're hearing in the news and from politicians, certainly. Maybe that's the purpose of art.
Does that answer the question? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Adam Fitzgerald, and I'm a student here at Boston College. And it seems like there's a lot of discussion of grays and splitting hairs going on. And I don't want to accuse anyone, but my question is, are we erecting Satans by, basically challenging people that erect Satans? Aren't we just making monsters out of people that make monsters by going after the idea that there can't be an absolute good and absolute evil? I mean,
This is the recurring question.
yes.
And whether we can look to artists and people of complexity, not necessarily the same thing, but to give us something other than sort of idiotic rallying cries.
Well, I mean, it just seems like, I'm sorry, it seems like yesterday there was an orthodoxy that said there was black and white. And it seems today the orthodoxy is gray. And,
Where was this orthodoxy yesterday? I was talking about Homer, who's
I wasn't necessarily referring to you. I
or
meant
Shakespeare. I mean, basically, we never had that. That's a delusion. These things are fantasies. They're comforting to some people, but other people don't find them comforting.
Well, if these fantasies aren't comforting, and as you said before, the idea of a benevolent God is such an excellent idea, then really what is the conflict here?
Some people don't want to believe in fantasies. They'd rather have complexity. I'm sorry, we just keep going around the circle. I'm sure there are artists who are true believers, and they would believe in something very...
Oh, I am, but I mean, I'm a true believer. I mean, I'm an absolute rock bottom Christian, but I have wonderful doubts too, and you know, but I'm thinking about black and white thinking, you know, and all of that. And I think one of the big dangers with anything like that is projecting what's troubling you inside out to someone else. And you know, Osama bin Laden is a dry drunk. He's a millionaire with a drinking problem. And he's acting, you know, psychologically it's very interesting. Apparently one of these terrorists were out drinking in a striptease bar a couple nights before the attack, bragging that they were American Airlines pilots. I think psychologically there's something very, very interesting going on there. That America's the great Satan, it's the great evil. They're not, you know, they're doing something, projecting that onto us when, you know, they might have been attending to their own problems. And they certainly weren't willing to do that. And so there's some very fascinating clues. If I were a novelist, I'd be right in there, I think. You know, fascinating clues about what was going on with those individuals.
Well, it is fascinating because they seem in some respects very, very human. Very human. But in other respects, they seem to have an ideological fanaticism that most of us just can't comprehend. Now, were they doing it because maybe their families are getting some monetary rewards? Maybe they were doing it for reasons of family.
The families were mostly middle class, as far as I can tell. They weren't impoverished.
So they didn't need it.
No, they didn't.
Well, that's a great mystery to many of us, what
yeah.
you've been indicating. Well, when you said you were a Christian, but is there a kind of general Christian? I mean, how would you have been during the Inquisition, for instance? So
probably on the rack.
Well, how about when there were witch hunts in Europe, the Dominicans were looking around for possible witches. I mean,
and some Dominicans were sheltering
yeah.
heretics too. I mean, again, you have all sorts of things going on.
It's complex, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and so it isn't so simple. History looks simple the farther you get away from it, but you're right in it. It wouldn't be that easy. Somebody would say, "Are you a Christian?" And you'd suddenly not know what answer to give because you gave it a slightly wrong answer.
Well, if I was faced with a terrorist saying, "I'll kill you," are you a Christian? You know, if you say yes, I'll kill you, I'm going to say, "Well, do my doubts matter now?" You know, what's going on here? You know, I don't know, and I don't know how I would have responded, say, during the Holocaust. You know, where a lot of convent schools were happy to hide people, and they saved a lot of people. But now, what would I have done? I have no idea.
And also during the Inquisition, people thought they were good. They weren't really saying that they were evil. You know, they thought they were purifying the Catholic Church.
They thought they were saving the souls of the people they killed. Yeah, they were very. Yeah. It was pretty nuts.
So what they were doing, they thought was good. We perceive it as mad. I wouldn't call it evil, but it's so cruel. The sadism, the cruelty. It wasn't just Catholics. In the New World, of course, the Puritans were doing it. They were witch hunting. You know. Protestants. So it's somehow an endemic to the human spirit.
Your question is a good one. Are we making monsters out of people who make monsters? And I think the short answer from the panel is yes. but
okay.
Let's leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Mike Michaud. I teach English. I'm an instructor at Boston College. Very quick and direct question. I was reading through the Boston College magazine last night and saw that one of the students, one of the alumni who was killed had graduated in May. So I walked in this morning and looked at my freshmen and tried to imagine if one of them was going to get killed in 4 years, how awful that is. And what I felt was rage. So I guess what I'm wondering is when you're done, and I know we've been sort of talking about this for a while, but when you finish playing with the people in the cage, because I like that analogy, at the end of the day, what do you do with rage in response to evil?
Me?
Anybody.
Bar fights?
There's a wonderful, I forget where this is in the scripture, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. And of course, it's much older than whatever, if it's a psalm or I think it's a gospel thing, that's a very ancient wisdom. And that's one of the hardest disciplines, to not let the sun go down on your anger. But that's, not to sleep with it. To me, that's what I try to do, but I'm not always successful. And rage, I think, if anything's going to give me insomnia, or at least keep me up at night, it's rage over something. And sometimes, a terrorist act, or just something that someone has done to me, some stupid, crazy thing. I wrote about that in the Cloisterwalk, about anger and how it would wake me up in the night, and I'll just keep going. I can think of the list of people I'm angry with. It'll go on forever if I don't stop it. So you try not to let it rule you, I guess, is the...
Well, rage could be very galvanizing. It could be something very positive. I think when it's just turned inward, of course, it's very debilitating and narcissistic. You could get very angry and justifiably so in social terms. If you look into the conditions in slaughterhouses, for instance. My friend Peter Singer was an animal rights person. That's a whole area that young people are very interested in. Many of my students are vegetarians. And that's something that older generations don't quite get into, But that is something they feel anger about, and it's not directed toward inward. It's something that's socially, I think, a healthy kind of anger.
Yeah, can I have one last little thing, if Nathan's not going to jump in? But one of my favorite theologians, the monk of Agrius in the 4th century, has a very interesting perspective on anger. In fact, that his translator says that some of what he says about the progression of anger would be familiar to you if you've studied schizophrenia as a psychiatrist. And he says that Evagrius believed that anger was a divine gift given to us to fight against the things that are really evil in the world, like
That's a good point.
But that we misuse it when we direct it against other people. The person who insulted me, or the person, that sort of thing. And so I think it is important to think of it as a gift that can be used, but it's a dynamite. It's dangerous.
Please.
My name is Bill Cortelio. I'm a cab driver in Brookline. Am I to understand from listening to you this evening that evil is not an external, a palpable force that exists, beyond oneself? I just want to get that clear. And if so, if you believe it isn't, can you state categorically that it isn't? I want to hear something forthright, that it is not. My personal experience is that it is. And Miss Oates, when you use the term extraterrestrial, I assume you meant it pejoratively. And if not, what did you mean? Are you kind of implicitly mocking Christians who believe there's an adversary?
Well, I wasn't mocking anyone. I was trying to be extremely pluralistic. Basically, I'm sort of a William Jamesian philosopher. I believe in pluralistic, opinions. People have different opinions.
Okay.
Some people are naturally, temperamentally true believers. They need to believe in something very clear. Other people are much more easygoing or skeptical. They just don't have that. We're different personalities, and we can't help it.
Excuse me, you're avoiding my question. Just for the three of you, can you state to this audience categorically that there's no such thing as an objective out there?
Sure we can. I'll do it. I honestly think that it doesn't matter. I've been the great categorical state. I finally have more... Coming from Israel, suddenly I had a skill. I always call everybody else for advice, all my friends. I had coping skill. I walk around New York swearing to my friends, like, are we safe now? Is there going to be anthrax in the subway? I swear to you there will be no... I walk around swearing to everyone. I've calmed hundreds, because I can state it, but I have no power. We just want to hear it. And
Well, I mean,
but it shouldn't, this is, I use the example, and here, and I did tear it out of the paper because it amazed me when President Bush said, evil knows no holiday, evil doesn't welcome the Thanksgiving or Christmas season, and, you know, I really want to ask the reverse question. Does the president really think that evil celebrates Arbor Day but not Christmas? Like, but I'm not mocking. I'm telling you that
No, you're very funny and clever. Well, my question, you haven't asked my question.
My question, I have an answer. The answer is, it's called, in Israel they always talk about tolerance. This is why there will never be peace in Israel, because they want mutual tolerance between the societies. I find it so insulting to be tolerated. Don't tolerate me. And the only example I can give you is that my sister is very religious. And even when she's Jewish, I'm Jewish, she's very religious. If I'm in her kitchen and I make a knife not kosher, and I know I've done it, even though I believe it means nothing, I will take it aside and I will tell her this is no longer usable with no one watching, because I do not believe it all, but I respect her beliefs, and she respects mine. So I don't, the answer is respect. We're not, you know, and I don't know Kathleen's beliefs, but you know, and I don't know your beliefs either, but I'm thinking, anyway, but nonetheless, point being, you're not going to get me to believe in that tonight.
Well,
I can't.
My parting question is, you believe people who do believe in an adversary and external force, external evil, do you believe maybe those people should be burned at the stake?
In Christian of course not. In Christian terminology, you have the advocate and you have the tempter. You know, and I'm very comfortable with those words. Now, whether or not you want to pin me, I'm no philosopher. I flunked philosophy at Bennington, which is bad. You know, that's low. But you know, I'm very comfortable with those as images, and I guess I would say I see plenty of evidence of evil in human behavior. But to say it's an entity, something out there,
that's what I'm looking for.
That I'm not comfortable with. But if you want to talk about the tempter and the advocate as things I've experienced. I mean, that's good Christian.
No, I think you've got your answer. It's not the one you want, but Joyce Carlos began by saying that even as she reads the scripture, it's not, evil is not a theological entity. Voila.
Hi, my name is Kelly Bruce. I have a question actually about the craft of writing. And I'd actually like to turn around what we've been talking about a little bit and ask you to comment on, and I guess agree or disagree, as practitioners of the craft of writing, if you might actually think that doing that is sort of an embodiment of a utopian vision, as opposed to always dealing with evil. And I know that, Mr. Englander, what you've said, that you do deal with evil a lot in your work, but I don't mean that in the way of you're trying to create a perfect world. Of course, there are tragedies throughout literature, but as writers, you are in control of the world you create. And so I wonder if you would just comment on the fact that as writers, that spark is an embodiment of a utopian desire of all of us, and you just happen to be very talented at it. You can actually put those things down on paper for us all.
Such a nice question. That last question. Well, I thought it was a wonderful question. And I think basically there is a certain tenderness and idealism, and I guess you could call it utopian. That's not a word that I feel comfortable with. A kind of feeling of community when we're writing. We hope, we don't expect, but we hope maybe somebody else will read it. You know, and as I said, there's a certain tenderness there and an idealism. But at the same time, to say it's utopian seems a little bit grand. Most of us have very modest expectations about the influence of our words. And we're storytellers, and we tend to fall in love with our own characters, but we don't really expect, we hope, but we don't expect other people to love them.
Yeah. Nathan, do you want to answer that? Okay.
No.
One more question, please.
Hi, my name's Benjamin Walker, and the reason I came tonight, because I was really excited about hearing three writers address this concept of evil, because I'm not religious myself, and I really believe that it is through fiction that if we have a chance at really sort of defining what evil is, I read a lot, and I read mostly fiction, and I really believe that's really where, in our modern age, we can find this concept of evil. But And I really liked Kathleen's idea of sort of looking within to sort of find this. But then Chris brings up the provocative story of David and Goliath. And I was sitting in the audience, and everyone just sort of freezes up. The whole idea of looking within at our very selves and thinking that maybe we could be Goliath really kind of freaked everybody out. And Joyce started, pounding the table, talking about the handouts that we, give around the world.
I wasn't pounding
and
the
Kathleen
table.
seconded the motion,
I wasn't
basically
pounding
saying
the
about,
table.
it's not a
Excuse
pearl.
me.
All right. Sorry.
I wasn't pounding the table.
Okay.
Don't put me in your fantasy.
All right, sorry. But
But
Kathleen talked about the Pearl Harbor thing. She basically wanted to say that we don't have a Pearl Harbor right now, but there are 1,000 people like rotting away in prison of Middle Eastern descent right now, and most of them haven't even been charged. And Ashcroft just sent out another 5,000 handouts for more.
The only point I'm making that's 1,000 people, but that's not almost the entire Japanese American population of the country. You see,
but it starts slow. He sent out 5,000 more invitations or handouts. But my question is simple. It's just basically how, as writers, can we really just, maybe as a closing remarks, really see in your own works how you're going after this concept of evil? Just like one sentence from each of you, please.
Haven't you been listening, young man?
We've already been saying this all evening.
I hope, actually, one of the things I hope is a crazy hope, because I've always thought I was too lazy to write a novel. Here I am sitting next to Joyce Carol Oates. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I think maybe this sort of situation we're in now might really prompt me to actually write a novel. To deal with the complexity of human evil.
But the great novel by Dostoevsky, The Possessed, is basically about this situation.
Amen.
And you've just read it, and it's a massive novel, and it's filled with humanity, it's filled with stories, it's filled with all sorts of bizarre things. Dostoevsky loved to write, he loved to tell these stories. But what you're left with in the Devils or the Possessed is a sense of chaos, that society was disintegrating, not just because there were mad people and wicked people, but because the good, intelligent people weren't strong enough.
Is there a last word?
Maybe to the last gentleman's question, but that's, he did at the beginning there say that he reads a lot of fiction. I just think it's where you find your solace. I mean, everyone has different questions. I mean, I write books because I was in a very religious world, and, religion was going to kill me, but books saved my life. Kafka had the answers to my questions, or he didn't even have the answers, but I like that. He wasn't afraid to look at them and say, oh my God, there are no answers. So I just think it's about, we said complexity. I have no closing statement. That's what I should have said.
Complexity is a good word to end.
The closing thought is that there are a lot of good books out there to be read, a lot of them by our guests. Thank you, Nathan Englander, Joyce Carol Oates, and Kathleen Norris.
I guess we didn't even anticipate it.
Thank you.
Reception downstairs till around 10:30. Thank you.